Hey, welcome to the last installment for Tuesday, January 17th of House Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're here with Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office here to lay some foundation and knowledge for us, a little Pensions 101. So Chris, without further ado,
Sure.
being here with us today.
My pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Roop. I'm a senior fiscal analyst with the Joint Fiscal Office. I know some of you who have been on the committee in the last biennium have heard about pensions sort of ad nauseum, and there's also some new members here. So I think my goal here is just to give people sort of a high level overview of what pension systems are, how they work, some of the key terms you'll see, and then go into a little bit of detail about what has happened to the state employee and teacher retirement systems over the last year and the impact that Act 114 that was passed last session had on the system. So I'm just going to walk through. I have about 18 or 20 slides here. They are on the committee website. Then afterwards, Andrea and I will stay late and grade all of your quiz papers and leave a gold star for whoever has the best grade. But let's just start here on slide 2. I'll just sort of walk through some key concepts and some terms you'll hear as we talk about pensions. So pension systems are a method of pre-funding the cost of future retirement benefits. What that really means is over the course of a employee's career, both the employee and the employer pay into the pension systems over the course of their career. And the idea is the amount of money they pay in will be enough to fund the future cost of their retirement benefits when they retire. We call this concept the normal cost. So you'll often see normal cost referred to a lot. That is what you should pay over the course of a member's career to make sure there is enough money sitting in the fund when they retire to fund their benefit. But none of us here have a crystal ball. None of us can predict the future. If we could, we would all be very wealthy and not be sitting around talking about pensions right now. So all of these are based on long-term actuarial assumptions. How do you know how much money you need to set aside? It's all based on long-term actuarial assumptions. But the reality from year to year doesn't always meet those assumptions. Sometimes a cost might be overfunded or not fully funded. Maybe your assumption was you'd get a 7% investment return and you got 3 or you got 10. Maybe you were assuming certain retirement rates that didn't pan out. When the reality doesn't meet the assumptions, that's reflected in what we call the unfunded liability. And that is a really long way of saying that's the gap between how much you owe and how much you have on hand to pay those benefits. And that unfunded liability represents a debt that has to be paid off with interest over time. So we call that amortizing. It's kind of like your home mortgage, but it works a lot different, where you make a series of periodic payments over the course of a defined period of time. There's principal and interest in it. And by the end of that period, you will be fully funded, or at least that's where the math points you to. Every year, that unfunded liability gets recalculated. So they do an actuarial valuation every fiscal year. They figure out all the gains and losses over that year and recalculate how much the unfunded liability is at that point in time. You then, under our system, have one fewer year to pay it back every year because the systems are meant to be fully funded by 2038. So it's kind of like refinancing a debt every year where 1 year gets shaved off and the balance gets recalculated. Clear as mud. A long way of saying the unfunded liability is kind of a way of reflecting the risk associated with the fact that your assumptions don't always meet reality, and sometimes your assumptions change. You will hear a phrase called ADEC, an acronym ADEC, ADEC, all the time. That stands for Actuarially Determined Employer Contribution. That is the amount that the actuaries say needs to be paid every year to fully fund the normal cost and make the required payment on the unfunded liability. So when you see ADAC, you should think this is what the actuaries say should be the employer, that's the E in ADAC, should be paying in to sort of fully fund the system according to their projections. We have 3 major statewide pension systems. I am not talking about VMERS, the municipal system, because that is not a system that the state budget supports. The VMERS is fully funded by the participating members and employers. So the towns and their members all contribute in. You won't see a line item in the state budget to support VMERS. So we typically just focus on the state system and the teacher system. Pension systems at the end of the day are really complicated, but they sort of boil down to one thing. Whenever you are a member in retirement, how much you are going to receive as a retirement benefit is defined by a formula. So you'll often hear people call defined benefit retirement systems. These pension systems are defined benefits. It is very straightforward. The benefit you get is defined by a specific formula in statute. And typically that factors in the years of service you've worked, your average final compensation, and multiply it against some sort of benefit multiplier. So that gives you a good sense. You can sort of do the back of the envelope by figuring out that math. But in reality, how much a member will receive in retirement is based on their survivorship elections and also based on cost of living adjustments as well. So there's sort of a base benefit that's computed by your years of service, your average final compensation, what plan you're in, then what survivorship choices you make. And then every year based on inflation, there's an automatic COLA that is compounded on that benefit. Slide 3, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but it just gives you a sense of the three systems, where they're created in statute. There's some links here that go to the treasurer's website so you can see who are on the retirement boards for the various systems. Something that's really interesting to note here is all three retirement systems, and this is a common structure, are jointly managed by representatives of sort of the employer and labor organizations. So the teachers union, the state employees unions all have members sitting at the table, as do the employers, meaning sort of the administration. State treasurer serves as a trustee on all three retirement boards, and they sort of manage the retirement office. And you'll hear from Tom Galanka, the chair of VPIC, after me. VPIC, the Vermont Pension Investment Commission, they're the entity that jointly invests all the assets for the pension systems. So they make all of the financial decisions, and that is a group that Representative Hooper is very familiar with. Hooper of Burlington is very familiar with, and 2 years ago, this legislature added 2 more seats to VPIC and made it. They sort of spun it off as an independent commission. It used to be a committee within the treasurer's office. Slide 4 just gives you a real quick overview with some pictures. You can see here the state employee system on the left and the teachers on the right. Prior to the Great Recession, both of the pension systems were in a much stronger financial position. And you can see really around like 2007, 2008, the orange line that represents the liabilities and the blue line that represents the assets were a whole lot closer together. But then they really started diverging after the Great Recession, and it just kept growing. That gap between the orange line and the blue line represents the size of the unfunded liability. You'll also hear this concept of funded ratios. What we're really talking about funded ratios is what is the actuarial value of the assets divided by the liabilities. So when you say the state employee system is 69.9% funded, that means at that point in time, they had 69.9% of the assets on hand to pay the liabilities that they will owe in the future. It is extremely common for defined benefit systems to have an unfunded liability because, again, reality just doesn't jive with your long-term assumptions from year to year. The presence of an unfunded liability in and of itself, I would not consider cause for alarm. What you should pay attention to is it growing or is it shrinking over time? Why? And can the employer manage the costs associated with closing and paying off that unfunded liability? So unfunded liabilities are sort of a fact of life. And, you know, its presence in and of itself is not a cause for panic. But you want to understand what's driving that number and try to figure out what is the long-term trajectory and how much does it cost to close it. So slide 5, why did that gap grow over time? You're going to see a lot of my charts and a lot of what I say really focuses on the start of FY 2009 to the present. The reason why is because that's our current amortization period. So we have a closed 30-year amortization period that began at the start of FY09 and runs to the end of FY38. So that by FY38, the liabilities are projected to be paid off and the system would be 100% funded. But there wasn't just any one thing that caused the unfunded liabilities to grow. It's really a mix of factors, and they're not all unique to Vermont. A lot of systems nationwide have dealt with these issues since the Great Recession. You'll see the biggest cause, and something to keep in mind on this goofy little chart I have on slide 5 is a positive value above the line is a bad thing. That is something that added to the unfunded liability. A negative is a good thing. That is what chipped away at the unfunded liability balance. But you can see changes to actuarial assumptions were the largest driver of the unfunded liability increases. So 769 million in the teacher system, 489 million in the state system. What we're really talking about with changes to actuarial assumptions are changes to the assumed rate of return, and changes to things like your long-term demographic projections. You know, what are your mortality tables? What are your retirement assumptions? Things like that. When those change, sometimes your unfunded liability will go up or go down. Unfortunately, on balance, in this amortization period, all those changes, net of all of them, have caused the hole to get deeper. You also see investment performance not meeting assumptions was a pretty significant factor. Most of that was the impacts of the Great Recession. Salary experience, retirement and net turnover experience. So what that retirement and net turnover really means, did the workforce behave the way you thought it would in terms of what percentage of people are working until retirement and then they leave upon retirement? Net turnover is what do the people look like in the workforce who enter and leave for reasons other than retirement? So if I get hired at 25, leave at 31, and I'm not going to get a benefit for another 30 some years, that would sort of be factored into the net turnover assumption as well. You'll also see on the very, very far left that the payments that have been made into the systems have essentially treaded water up to this point. They haven't had a huge impact on the unfunded liability balance. That is due to our actuarial amortization method. Your home mortgage is what would be considered a level dollar. You pay the same amount every month for 30 years. We don't do it like that. Our pension systems, like many others, structure their payments to increase to sort of reflect what we think payroll is going to increase over time. So if we assume payroll is going to increase by 3% a year, the payments are structured to grow by 3% a year. So you pay more every year in dollar terms, but the theory is that it kind of represents a constant amount of your total budget over time. The downside to that is all of your principal payments tend to be backloaded toward the end of the amortization period. So we are now at that point where we're about halfway through the amortization period, where our payments are going to be chipping away more and more at the principal. But for the first, 14 or 15 years up to this point, we've basically been treading water. Something I do want to point out is you'll see the third column from the right, contribution shortfall, former OPEB funding. In the past, teacher OPEB, other post-employment benefits, fancy way for saying retiree healthcare benefits, hadn't been fully funded. Through FY15, these benefits were actually paid out of the corpus of the teacher pension fund, which had the effect or a similar actuarial effect of putting this debt on, just putting the cost on the state's credit card to pay off with 7% interest. It was a similar impact of the state just not fully funding the ADAC. But the state did in fact fully fund the ADAC. If you hear people say that, well, the reason the systems are in such bad shape is because nobody was paying into them, that's not entirely true. The state system was actually fully funded in 2007, and the state has fully funded its actually overfunded the ADAC in the years since. The teacher system is a little more complicated of a story. From 1979 through 2006, the ADAC was only fully funded in 4 years. The state had systematically not fully funded the teacher pensions. Where you see that show up now is the fact that the teacher system entered this amortization period less funded than the state system did. And about out of the 1.8 or so billion dollars of unfunded liability on the or on the teacher system, roughly 353 million of that was due to legacy underfunding and the former OPEB practices. So that's a relatively small piece of the total sort of problem, if you will, a little less than a fifth of it, I think. But the fact that the funding practices of the past weren't necessarily what the actuarially recommended amounts were, are adding about $28 million to the bill that we pay every year. So that is not something it's not a hole that goes unfilled. If you don't make if you don't fully fund the recommended amounts one year, it just adds to your future costs in all the future years. So pay a little more now or you pay a lot more later is sort of a key takeaway with pension funding. Slide 6, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I just wanted to show you the membership trends of both systems. Really, since the Great Recession, the systems have matured a lot. What we mean by that is the number of retired members who are getting a benefit out of the system has increased a great deal, while the active members who are currently working and not yet drawing a benefit has been pretty steady in both systems. There's been some fluctuation from year to year, but now with the systems, there's roughly one retiree for every member who's active. What you're seeing here is the maturing of the workforce more broadly. I mean, you're seeing the huge cohort of baby boomers retiring since the Great Recession. This is not unique to us. But what this does mean is it gets harder to close the gap through investment gains alone when you've got more and more people drawing benefits out of the system. So you're putting more demands on the cash flow of the system. And that just tends to mean that a more mature system isn't quite as nimble. It doesn't behave the same way that a brand new system without any sort of ongoing cash needs right now has. Whenever you've got a lot of cash going out the gate to fund retiree benefits, that tends to change your sort of investment risk profile a little bit. It enhances your liquidity needs. And it just, whenever you're a system that has this many people drawing benefits out, you tend to be at a little higher risk for higher employer payments required to close the gap. Slide 7. So those of you who are around last biennium remember Act 114 and some history here. The last round of experience studies. So every few years, it used to be every 5, now it's every 3 years. The actuaries take a deep dive to see what happened in the last few years. And they look at how did experience match your assumptions? And does it make sense to change your assumptions moving forward? So that happened after the FY19 valuation. There were a lot of demographic assumptions that were updated, and very significantly, the assumed rate of return was lowered from 7.5% to 7%. That whole package of changes caused very sizable increases in the unfunded liabilities and ADACs from FY21 to FY22. So you're seeing in a 1-year period, the ADACs increased by roughly $100 million. And the unfunded liabilities increased by, well over $500 million. So in response to that and to see, are there strategies that can be pursued to try to lower the size of that jump from year to year? The legislature created through Act 75 a task force that met all through the summer of 2021 with labor representatives, an administration representative, and legislators to see if they could come up with some recommendations. They did. There is a link, a live link in the document to the website. The report and the recommendations are a thrilling read. But something really important that I think to stress is the task force agreed on this package of recommendations unanimously. They made it into a bill that passed the legislature unanimously twice. So it passed unanimously, and then a veto was overridden unanimously. Some key features, I don't want to get into the weeds of what was in that bill, but just some key features were employee contributions for active members increased. Some of them were sort of phased in over a period of time. There were some changes to the cost of living formula for future retirees. So for a lot of groups, there was a maximum of 5% of CPI, that was dropped to 4%. and there was a requirement that you needed to be retired for at least 12 months to get your first COLA. That was changed to 24 months for most groups. Something important was that these changes were not made to anybody who's currently retired. Everybody who's currently retired were completely sort of held harmless, if you will, from the changes. And some of the COLA changes were meant to only apply to people who become eligible for normal retirement after the end of this fiscal year. The reason why it was designed that way is you didn't want to create a lot of changes that would encourage people who could retire to retire. So that gave people a little bit of time to get their head around the changes. The state made a $200 million one-time appropriation to the pension systems. That was split roughly proportionately to how much of the unfunded liabilities each system represented. There was a commitment made by the state to make higher employer contributions above the ADAC. So we call that the plus payment. That is supposed to kick in beginning in FY24 at $9 million per system, $12 million per system in 25, and then in 26 it'd be $15 million per system until each system reaches 90% funded. Something really, really significant as part of Act 114 was OPEB benefits are now being pre-funded. And I'm not going to get into OPEB too much today, just in the interest of time, but just like the pensions are pre-funded, the OPEB systems are now pre-funded, where in the past we had just been paying the bill as it came due to pay for the premiums for today's retirees. Under pre-funding, a little bit of money, a normal cost is going to be set aside every year over the course of a member's career. That money is invested, it grows over time, and then the benefit will be funded whenever they are retired. The pre-funding has a tremendous benefit to the state's balance sheet. Due to the way the accounting rules work, when you're pre-funding, you can discount your liabilities using a 7% assumed rate, discount rate tied to our assumed rate of return. That in and of itself cut $1.5 billion with a B dollars off of our unfunded liabilities as a state. That very little accounting change. That buy down of unfunded liability comes with a cost though. Pre-funding costs a little bit more every year than PAYGO does because you need to build up a pool of assets over time to fund those future benefits. So that's the trade-off. Just a couple other quick things to touch on was in the VSERS system, a new group was created for corrections employees that will begin next fiscal year. Corrections employees expressed a strong desire to have a more robust ability to retire at 55 with at least 20 years of service, which statute currently allowed them to do, but under a reduced multiplier of 1.67%. This new group would allow you to retire at 55 with 20 with a 2.5% multiplier, which is a more generous benefit. That means you could retire with 20 years of service at 50% of your average final compensation. Comes with a higher cost. Part of the deal was the 4.68% of pay, higher cost associated with that benefit enhancement is paid by the Group G members themselves. So all of their employee contribution rates are 4.68% higher than Group F members, which they currently were in. So the benefit was enhanced a bit for that group, but that group is bearing the actuarially projected cost of that higher benefit. There's also a path forward for the teacher system when it's in a better funded position to incrementally increase their COLA benefit. Right now, they receive a COLA tied to 50% of the net percentage change of CPI, and the state employees receive 100%. A construct was put in the law that says there's sort of a side account created with surplus general funds that if you have enough money in there and the system's at least 80% funded, the benefit can be incrementally increased as long as there's money to pay for that. All of the details are spelled out in the fiscal note of S286 last year. So I would direct you all, if you're really hurting for a reading material, to peruse that document. So what's happened in the last year? Slide 8. Key findings, the actuarial evaluations came out in the end of October, and the funded ratios for both pension systems improved, which is a good thing. But it's really due to Act 114. Act 114 was the reason the systems gained ground. If the legislature did not act last year, the unfunded liabilities would have increased pretty substantially in both systems. Why? Well, after a very strong year in FY21, our pension investments really took a hit in the last year and saw negative returns in FY22. But inflation is also causing a big risk to the systems. Inflation pushes up salary growth rates for the current workforce. It also pushes up the cost of living adjustment formula for currently retired members. So when inflation and the CPI are running higher than you assume, that leads to actuarial losses. And just again, a few highlights here of Act 114. Those benefits were that $200 million one-time payment, those plus payments that will begin this year that really accelerate pay down of the unfunded liability. The changes in employee contribution rates freed up dollars in employer pension costs, and the changes to the COLA benefit also lowered both the normal cost and the unfunded liabilities. Slide 9 just shows you the summary of everything that happened across those two systems. The unfunded liabilities decreased by $144 million. So for the state system, the decrease was $26 million, and for the teacher system, $117.9 million. The market, something interesting that happened is the market value of assets declined by $232 million. But something to keep in mind is we smooth in our gains and losses every year. So the investment markets can be extremely volatile from year to year. And FY21 was probably the best, I think the best performance since 1983 or so. And then last year, it wasn't so good. To help us with our funding calculations, gains and losses are smoothed out over a 5-year period. That way you don't have really drastic spikes in your funding requirements from year to year. This might be a good time to stop.
Yeah, so I know Representative Byron has his hand up. So Chris, thank you very much for, that was a big download. So a lot of stuff that's familiar to me and Representative Higley and Hooper and Rowicki, but if you're new to pensions, there's a lot there. This is all meant to be like a first,
Absolutely.
First pass. And if you have questions or want to sit down with Chris, he has volunteered generously of his time. So Representative Byron.
Thank you, Chair. My question for you, and apologies if you already stated this during your presentation, but when you're doing your actuarial projections, what do you bake into the math for inflation as a standard percentage?
That's a great question. So I would not be doing the calculations. The actuaries do the calculations. But the long-term assumption for inflation right now, I believe, is 2.3%. Something that's interesting about that is this is actually a source of gain for the systems until about a year ago, because inflation had been trending pretty low in recent years. It was in the last 2 years that trend has reversed. So now you're seeing inflation higher than that 2.3% assumption.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions for Chris on the first piece before he moves on? All right, great. So I know that we have our next guest in the room. So, and I know that there's a lot more. So Chris, I'm going to defer to you on if you want to do a couple more slides, if you want to continue your presentation, or if there are summary things you might want to say to sort of put a cap on this piece.
Yeah,
have you back to talk about the rest and OPEB.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to come back, and I'm also happy to talk, as you mentioned, offline, sort of one-on-ones with any member who wants. Slide 10, how about let's wrap this up in 4 minutes, and then we can sort of move on, and I can come back if you want. Slide 10 is going to be your investment performance chart. That's what you're going to want to grill the two gentlemen sitting over there who are coming up right after me about. But you can see sort of how the market value returns compared to the smoothed actuarial returns from year to year, and how year to year your volatility can be really big, but that smoothing is intended to try to average it out and not have really big spikes from year to year, and how much you need to pay into the pension systems. Slide 11 and 12 just give you some visual history of the progress of the system since the start of the amortization period. Slide 13 shows you the gains and losses just in the last year. So you can see the impacts of Act 114 and the beneficial impacts there, but also see how COLA, inflation showing up in the salary experience and the COLA experience are leading to losses. I am going to skip ahead to slides 18 and 19 and wrap it up. So these slides are going to make your head hurt. I apologize. Bear with me because I'm trying to give you a lot of information here and it will make sense when I walk through it for a second. So slide 18, I direct your attention to the FY24 column. The blue bar at the bottom is the normal cost. Then the orange bar above that is your unfunded liability payment. And that gray bar above it with the 9, that's the plus payment on top of the actuarially recommended amount. Sum those up and you reach $130.9 million in that black square at the top of the column. That's going to be the total budgetary request for the VSERS system across all funds in FY24. So you can track that across the bars and see what you expect the annual funding requirements would be. A lot of money, right? Well, what if you all didn't do anything last year? We played around in JFO and looked at all of the experience that happened last year, but backed out the impacts of the one-time money that was made in Act 114 and the changes to plan provisions in Act 114 to try to figure out, all right, if everything else happened, but that extra money wasn't put in and no changes to the benefits were made, where would we be? And you'll see the calculation in greater detail, which I'm not going to walk into now, back on slide 15. But had the legislature not acted last year, the VSERS unfunded liability would have increased by about 95 million and the teachers by about 38 million. So I took those sort of hypothetical numbers and ran them through an amortization model that replicates what the actuaries do, where the payments are made 3% a year. They're to grow in 3% increments. The payments are assumed to be made in the middle of the year, so on and so forth. And if the legislature didn't do anything last year, you would be looking at what I expect to be a $140.5 million expense. That's that sort of light orange color on the dotted line way in the back. That's how to read this chart. So the numbers in the black square boxes right above the columns show you what I expect the bill will be in the future, holding all else constant, all assumptions perfectly met in the future. And the sort of orange paler number above it on that really vertically sloped line gives you a good sense of what if we had the same losses this year, but the legislature didn't make any changes. So you can see that tells a pretty compelling story, especially when you get out in the future years closer to 2038. Flip over to slide 19 and it's the same story for the teacher system. So that sort of added cost of the plus payments are more than paid for by sort of the relative savings from all the other changes that were made. Slide 20 has my contact information and some links to a wealth of resources that are on the Treasurer's website as well as on the JFO website. I encourage you to peruse them and I'm happy to walk through them at your convenience. If you are really searching for what is a pension system and how does the benefit work at sort of the most fundamental level, the last two slides of my deck here have sort of a high-level summary of the key plan provisions for each group. This is not an exhaustive list. The Treasurer's Office has some great summary documents on their websites. But when you hear people talk about, VSERS Group C, VSERS Group D, what do those mean? This sort of explains who's in which group, how many people are in it, how their benefits are calculated for a new member entering the system today. There's plenty of other details about, survivorship options and things like that I did not put on here. But I just want to give you all a very high level sense of how the benefits for each group differ from one another.
So, Chris, I want to ask you a few things that should illustrate or put a big underscore under some of the things you're saying. So your model estimates that in the last year of our current amortization schedule, if we hadn't done Act 114, instead of having 45 million in normal cost and 111 million of ADEC for that last big ADEC payment, which goes away in fiscal 2039 if we make all these payments right.
Under current law.
Yes. So everybody looking at these big scary charts, the idea behind this entire amortization schedule, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is that the big orange scary number, we started doing that so that we would get on track to having a fully funded pension system by the end of this amortization period of 2038. So we're making this $90 to $111 million investment over this time period so that we get to a point where if all of our actuarial assumptions and all the things that we're putting into the model bear out, we're getting back to just paying the normal cost by 2038.
That is a fair summary, Mr. Chair. And I would say, whenever you're after 2038, assuming that remains law until 2038, you'd be on the hook. The employer would be on the hook for fully funding the normal cost. And those orange bars, like I said, it's sort of unrealistic to expect an unfunded liability will never be there, but it would be a whole lot smaller. And that orange bar would be a whole lot smaller as a result. So, if you are assuming a 7% assumed rate of return and you get 6.5 1 year, and you have a little bit of an unfunded liability, you'd need some of that orange column to pay it off, but it'd be much smaller.
Or it's still pretty big if all of our average rates of return for the entire amortization are a lot less than 7%, right? The other thing you've got on here is that if we didn't do Act 114, that $111 million would be $216 million. Am I reading that right?
That looks right. I would want to look at my spreadsheet for what went into this, but you could see sort of ghosted out in the back there. The blue would represent what the normal cost would have been, and then the orange right above it would be
so the total,
the unfunded liability.
The revised normal cost and
would be, that'd be 216.6 for the state and 331 for the teachers.
Right, so it's an extra $60 million in that final year. So we've saved ourselves some money by making those investments.
You did. And Mr. Chair, this sort of the way to describe this is you're paying a little more now to avoid paying interest costs in the big picture and to avoid paying even more in the future. So.
All right. Well, we will certainly, I think, have more conversations. And as I told Chris, we already got a little bit of dabbling in what OPEB means. And we'll be talking about healthcare and other post-employment benefits, I imagine, in the context of some of the other work that we're going to be asked to weigh in on. So, Chris, thank you for giving us this first little toe in the water with pensions. I didn't have PTSD from last year too badly. None of our other veteran Gov.Ops folks did either. But I'd like to turn it over now to an introduction to VPIC, and we have Tom Blanca here. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon with our new House Government Operations Military Affairs Committee, and I'm trying to give you a little bit of a taste of what we experienced in House Gov.Ops in the last biennium. So I appreciate you being here with us to give a little introduction and overview of VPIC today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. We've I don't know how, we sent you a lot of information, and I want to preface that by saying a lot of that is mandated through legislation. The annual report has to come to the House Gov.Ops committee by January 15th. Act 75 required us to come up with a comp study, which had to come to you guys by January 15th. So that's included in the packet I sent today. And then just normal introductory information that I sent. And last year at this committee meeting, they asked to formulate a carbon policy, which VPIC completed last year as well. That's included in the packet. I don't need to go into any of that or all of that or whatever you want to go into. But I was hoping today just to introduce VPIC, answer any questions you may have, and tell you what some of the themes we've been going on over the past couple of years, where we're at, where VPIC came from. Representative Hooper is a member of VPIC. And for those of you who don't know, VPIC is the Vermont Pension Investment Commission. It used to be called the Vermont Pension Investment Committee, and it used to be a division of the State Treasurer's Office. A couple of years ago, we started the process of separating this out from the Treasurer's Office and creating an independent commission with our own independent budget, our own independent staff, and our own independent location. And I brought with me Eric Henry, who's the current Chief Investment Officer for the state of New York, and he helps us manage the money. Ultimately, this is where all the money comes from your prior discussion, and what do we do with it? How do we invest it? How do we preserve it and protect it as a fiduciary trust? And so that's really what VPIC is. We're the fiduciary board set up by the state of Vermont to manage the billions of dollars that accumulate, and potentially we'll have a couple billion more over the next couple of years. And how do we efficiently and effectively manage this to the best of our ability? Obviously, this past year was not great. The year before was a lot better, but we do have a process and a procedure to look at the portfolio, and we have a set board that helps us make those decisions. I'm chair of that board. I've been chair since 2016. Since that time, we've experienced a significant amount of change. We've gone from a board, and Representative Hooper's been on the board since that time. He could attest to all of the changes we've gone through, including hiring an internal staff, revitalizing our whole portfolio, switching out our whole portfolio, indexing a significantly large portion of the portfolio so we lower fees. We've lowered fees tremendously over the past 5 years, dropping the overall charge by, I would say, 7 million less per year just on managing twice as much in assets. So we've had significant improvement in both the fee structure as well as the asset focus that I think VPIC entertains, each month. In the packet I sent was an organizational chart, and part of Act 75 changed who were members of VPIC, who are voting members, who are alternates. It's basically made up of 2 members from VSERS, 1 voting, 1 non-voting, 2 members from VSTERS, 1 voting, 1 non-voting, 3 members from the governor's office.
So I'm really trying so hard to be a jargon buster. Pensions is an area where it is very, very difficult. So I just wanted to define VSERS, VEMRs, and VSTERS for folks who are uninitiated.
VPIC manages the monies from the teachers group, which is VSTERS, the state employees group, which is VSERS, and the municipal group, which is the Vermont VEMRs. And so collectively, they give us all of their pension monies. We pool it in one pooled trust, and we manage it as one entity. And so when you hear those acronyms, VSERS, VEMRs, VSTERS, it's basically where we get the money from and where the pools of money belong to. The pension beneficiaries of those trusts ultimately own these funds. We just act as the fiduciary board that helps manage them from an investment point of view. Hopefully that answers it.
So you've got three big groups of active payers and retirees.
Yep.
Municipal employees, state employees, and teachers. Those are the 3 big funds that VPIC oversees the investment.
And the board is made up of appointees from each of those pension boards, the governor's office, the treasurer is a sitting member. And then we have also Act 75 added in a member from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and the Vermont School Boards Association. And so you have collectively, that's the board. I'm the chair of that board selected by the different members. And we utilize the Attorney General's office for our legal counsel. We have 3 staff people, Eric Henry being one, and then we have 2 others that work internally. And then we have an investment consultant that we hire. And we've changed that recently. We went from New England pension consultants that we had for many years to RVK, which they're a large pension consulting firm in the country. So we have a big support staff. We use the consultant as an extension of staff because 3 people to run this is relatively tight. And that was part of the reason for the comp study that the legislature asked us to do last year. Basic themes that we try to accomplish and what we've really been doing over the past couple of years would be in my presentation. And I think it summarizes really what we've been doing over the past 5-6 years. First thing is we've really been simplifying the investment process. And what I mean by that is somebody can easily explain what we own and we can know when it goes up and when it goes down. Because in the past, we had really complex and expensive investment products that were hard to explain, hard to understand, hard to know how they would move with the markets. So we've really made an effort over the past 5 years to really simplify that. A lot of that is indexing a tremendous amount of our equity exposure as well as our bond exposure. And then we use other active managers around the fringes where we see their active value. So the second theme we do is we try to reduce fees where appropriate. And that gets to the point of what does it cost us to run this plan? Well, VPIC itself has its budget and the pension boards have their own budget. But to run the fund, we have to pay investment managers to run this. And so we pay on average about 41 basis points, which is pretty good in regards to pension funds. We're one of the smallest in the country, but we're very competitive in regards to our overall fee rate. What does that translate into dollar amounts? Well, in comparison, 41 basis points probably runs about $26 million a year that we're paying investment managers outside of the state of Vermont. Our budget, which we include in the governor's budget right now, is probably about $2.5 million. So all in, that's where that 41 basis points comes into. And that's important because now we are responsible for submitting a budget to you guys. So I just want you to understand, well, how does that budget work? What do you get for that? And how does that help us save money on one side? So if we what I've always pushed for is having internal staff that can really critically analyze our investments and possibly save money outside. And that's really been the case. When I first came into this, we were paying probably 60, 65 basis points. So we were paying the same amount of money with half the amount of assets about 7, 8 years ago. We're paying about the same amount, but we have twice as much assets. And I think that's a testament to what we've accomplished and what we've changed in the trust. And that really goes to our staff. They underwrite everything and they tell us, well, what do we have? Where are the risks? How are the potential rewards? And I'll give you an example that we had just a couple of years ago. Our investment consultant had recommended a strong hold for one of our positions, which was this investment manager by Allianz, I believe. It was about $100 million. And their argument to that investment was it's one of their top picks. We should keep it. We should add more money to it. No one really on the board can understand what we had. Our new CIO reviewed it. The internal staff investigated it and came to the board with a recommendation to sell. And that was against our investment consultant. And I think this goes to the power of and the value of having a strong internal staff. That was the investment that Blue Cross Shield lost 50% of their pension fund. Now, we didn't have 50% of the pension fund in it, but we would have potentially lost $100 million. So it's decisions like that I think are very important for our pension board to really understand and to own. And because of that, we really avoid losses more than just make gains. So you got to look at it both ways. How can a strong internal staff really benefit the state of Vermont? And how can that translate in actual dollars? For example, of what we've done over the past couple of years. What we've also done over the past couple of years is underwrite more of a private equity strategy on a portion of our assets. We really need to manage liquidity because you have an outflow of cash for the state teachers of maybe about $15 million per month in terms of pension liabilities. And so we've really had to look at this portfolio both to maximize return with potentially some private equities, but also minimize the risk of not having enough money in a downturn. And so we've really, having internal staff to do that has been very helpful. And then finally, we really need to look at net returns. They must justify all the investment manager fees. And that's probably been a tenet of our board in terms of looking at our investments. And we have a policy-driven board where we have an investment policy statement that looks at our investment managers. And then we have an internal staff that vets that and gives us recommendations. So I'm really proud of the board that we have right now. I won't go through all these pages because I think it would just be a little overkill. But I think I'll point out one, which raises to, this is the one that looks like this with the 3 circles on it. I think this is really important for this committee to know, what did it take to get 7%? We talk about our assumed rate of return adjustment, or assumed rate of return. That's now one of the responsibilities of EPIC. It's our role now to decide, well, what is the assumed rate of return? And that affects your budgeting. It affects Chris when he comes back to you and says, you need to come up with this for an ADAC. Back in 1991, if we just invested, 98% in cash and 2% in bonds with relatively no risk, we could make 7%. In 2006, we would have to invest at about 60-40 mix between stocks and bonds, and the risk would have jumped up to about 7% per year. Last year or 2 years ago, to get that same 7%, you had to have relatively no cash and relatively no bonds and pretty much all equities. And so that's the dilemma. I think that's what we've been facing over the past 20 years.
So this is the question I was dying to ask Chris, but he's not the right person to ask when he brought up all of the things about our current inflationary environment that are putting, pressure, let's say, on the ADEC. Doesn't the increase in interest rates also have an impact that's helpful?
It will.
Aside of some of the safer investments?
Well, it will be because you'll have better cash flow. So your bond portion will pay out more, particularly on the short end. Now, you haven't really seen longer end yield curve reflect that just yet. So you're not getting longer term bond rates very high, but you are getting short term rates that are a lot higher. So the flip side of that is it's painful when that happens. So bond prices go down when interest rates go up. So the value of our bond investments over the past year have suffered. So this past year was hit really with a double whammy. Stocks went down and bonds went down in terms of value. We managed it and we were in the top tier of our peer group in that over the past year, but we weren't immune to market forces. Interest rates rising hurts bond prices. So the ultimate value is being hurt. Over time, that will get us back to prior years where we will be able to rely more on a cash flow approach to some more, distribution requirements, particularly in state teachers plan. But it's an interesting dilemma, but you do get higher cash flow, when you do have higher interest rates. Does that help?
That's very helpful. That it's not just about the interest rate of return, it's about the valuation. Chris, do you want to weigh in on that?
Mr. Chair, so I would concur that I'm not the person to ask this question to, but the only thing I would add to what Mr. Gallanka said was sometimes when you have interest rates going up, it can also hurt your equity returns too, because you are making it more expensive for companies to borrow money. So it can not always be helpful to companies' share prices.
Senator Byron, question.
Back to the 7% on the rate of return. How long have you been targeting that projected growth, and how often year over year do you hit that 7%? Is it a constant that you attain?
A year ago, we made 26%. Last year we were down 7.5%. So you're not going to hit it exactly. On average, it's our goal, obviously, to make that. Now, there's been pressure for us to potentially lower that, and states around the country are lowering that assumed rate of return. And so, the process in place right now is to wait for. And Chris probably explained this. There's an experience study that they go through. It was changed from every 5 years to now every 3 years. And after this current fiscal year, they will go through a process. There will be a new experience study, which looks at all the assumptions, this being one of them. There's been some debate on how VPIC should handle this, since this has been given to VPIC as a responsibility. By us not reviewing it every year, are we affirming it by our not acting on it? And so there's a question amongst VPIC, should we actually vote on this every year, that we agree that 7% is a good rate of return, or it should be 7.5%, or it should be 6.5%, whatever that is. VPIC right now has decided that we're going to formulate a policy that works with the legislature, works with the pension boards, because we understand the impact of this change. It can be quite significant. And we do want to have all the data that we can have to make an informed decision. So the plan is to wait for the experience study after this next fiscal year, and then come up with some recommendations to the legislature in regards to what we think, or come up with recommendations to the actuaries in regards to what VPIC thinks the assumed rate of return is going to be. And so it'll be an every 3-year process that we'll look at this. So it'll be one of those where you could have actuarial gains or you could have actuarial losses based on whether we meet it or not.
So I guess, so the 7% as a floating target year over year is attainable when you're hitting it, at least in the last several years. If you
asked me a year ago, I'd say we did it.
And those changed last year. I mean, it was like a gangbusters market year, right?
Yeah.
You're averaging.
It's really endpoints dependent. So if you asked me at the end of last June, I would have said, yeah, we've made it every year for the past 10 years on average. If you asked me this past June, no, we're at 6.5%. So where's that happy middle ground? And it's not. I think that's the reason for smoothing. It's the reason for, we'll give you our best guess estimate, but we are dependent on what the markets do in any given year, and we'll fully diversify the portfolio. We have a strict asset allocation process, and we look at that every year. And we do have consultants that give us ideas of what we think it's going to be, but you're going to be exactly right. It's going to be. And last year would be a perfect example. We would assume that estimated rate of return of 7%, and we had 25%. And then the following year, we assumed 7%, we're -8%. So I guess go from there. How well are we predictive? I think over a long-term period, we will be. We'll hit it pretty well. And I think it will give you some confidence that I think we're doing a good job in regards to managing the funds of the state. What I'd like to do, and a lot of this is what do we do in regards to environmental, social, and governance. I don't necessarily want to get into a lot of detail in regards to, unless you have questions on it. But I really wanted to talk about two things, particularly for this upcoming legislative session. And the last couple pages will really get into it. One of the recommendations from the legislature in Act 75 was that we complete a compensation study, which we did back in October and November of this past year. And I've included it in this copy. I don't necessarily need to go into it right now, but really what it says is we're in the bottom 10 percentile in regards to our peer group and what we pay our internal staff. And my argument is these staff people are probably the most valuable employees you have with the state. And I think we run a high risk potentially if we lose them or having to replace them, particularly since we only have 3. We've asked for another employee in our budget, and we may still ask for that because I think having another staff person would be quite helpful, particularly for fund accounting. And if we're going to get into working with the treasurer in regards to OPEB funds, or if we're going to be working with other state funds, I think 3 staff is very lean in comparison. So I just want to throw that out there. The second thing I want to point out is there's some cleanup work in regards to Act 75 we would recommend. And the last page really gets to that. A couple things we would do. There's 3 action items we look for the 2023 legislative initiatives. One would be to remove the remaining references to the Office of State Treasurer from the VPICS enabling statute. That'd be one thing. It'd be cleanup legislation we think would be helpful. The second thing, getting to my point in regards to the employees, we're working with the administration in regard to creating an executive pay plan. But to do that, we need to declassify the 2 VPIC employees, one of which is already declassified, but we want to declassify the other 2. And then we work with the administration on possibly implementing over time the Mercer recommendations for our comp study. And then the third item we'd like to do is add an investment accounting position to enable us to reduce private equity and other investment management fees further in-house and bring more of the operation into the state of Vermont. We put that in our initial recommended budget, but it was taken out by the administration, but we still feel it's important to ask that back with the legislature. We'll advocate for another person all day, particularly if there's a continued request for reports and projects and outside work. We're very limited with the internal staff. So if there's questions in regards to divestment or questions in regards to a comp study, we always have to go outside. And these investment consultants usually cost $100,000 or $150,000 a study. We think we can do a lot more efficiently, effectively if we work in-house. And so adding an extra person would give our 3-person staff a little bit more backup. So those would be the 3 legislative initiatives we'd like to propose here for 2023. But I'd really like to open up to any questions or comments or concerns and items that you'd like to see. I threw a lot of information at you in terms of the documents, so I apologize for that. But January 15th is when it's due. So we threw it all in there.
So if you haven't seen, we have all of those documents posted on the committee page under Mr. Galanka's name. So I would recommend everybody take a look at any of those pieces that they're interested in. And I'm sure that we will be discussing pensions some more and learning a little bit more over the next couple of weeks, and potentially looking at some of these legislative proposals and seeing what we can do to not do anything revolutionary, but just make sure that we're staying on the course that we set in the last biennium. So yeah, any questions for Mr. Galanka? Everybody's like totally expert on pensions, investments, interest rates, bonds. Okay, private equity. It was on the radio this morning. Fewer mergers and acquisitions in a higher environment.
It's our goal to help the state as best we can and to bring as much here in the state that we can do. So we're not spending so much in regards to outside dollars. And I want to, we brought in Eric. I didn't know if he had anything finally wanted to say, but he's brought a tremendous level of expertise to our internal staff. So I want to thank him for his help over the past couple of years.
Thank you. Nothing to add. Happy to take any questions.
I imagine there will be a number of questions that will come out of our reading of some of the materials from the reports that you just issued, but I really appreciate you coming in for this initial introduction and kind of walk through what DPIC is for the uninitiated here. And I know
I also included our budget. So as a new entity, we are subject to the budget process with the state. And this is our second year, so forgive us if we have errors in there, but we're working through it, and the administration has been extremely helpful in getting through. And I want to thank Treasurer Pierce in the past couple of years to help us get to this point. She's been tremendously helpful with me, and I look forward to working with Mike, Treasurer Pichek, and going forward. So I think there's a collaboration really with the Treasurer's Office and VPIC still, but it's now a separate and distinct entity with our board, helping to manage it. And in the next couple of years, it should be upwards of 10 billion, particularly so it's getting into, not that 6 billion isn't significant, but as it gets over 10 billion, it's a significant amount of assets for the state. And we want to be the best stewards that we can of these funds.
Well, I think one thing that you pointed out, but I just wanted to underscore for the committee is if you look at the VPIC fees over time, what Mr. Galanka was saying, where there's significantly more assets, but the percentage that we're paying to have that managed is lower. We want to help you find ways to make sure we're spending as little money as possible in order to.
Well, you want to spend as much money as possible, that you also have to be willing to spend money for good investments. And so there's a balance there. Representative Hooper, he's on your committee, so you have the benefit of a tremendous amount of expertise and history with VPIC going back to the beginning. So you have that benefit here on this committee.
Last call for questions. Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure
Thank you.
we'll be seeing you again.
Yep, we can come back anytime.
Thanks for all the reading material. All right. So that's it for today. We'll be going off live and